All right, welcome. So glad to everybody who's here. Can you do me a favor and type in the chat box if you can see me, if you can see my screen, and if you can hear me? Okay, fantastic. Hey, Anna. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So, all right, while we wait for folks to come on in, what I would love is to have you take a moment and to find that chat box and type in it what brought you here today. We love to, you're going to hear perspective. Next week, you'll hear about Gilad's perspective, but we are always excited to hear about what brought you to this question, what brought you to this research. We sit in our little research bat cave typing away, and we crave knowing what's going on the outside. So yeah, type in the chat box, what brought you here today? Insights, okay. Looking for some insight. And other people can also see your comments, which is great. So one of the things we're going to want is for you to feel like this is, at least in part, a two-way conversation. So, test out that chat box now. If you've got comments or questions or concerns as we go through this, we want you participating with us in a live back and forth way. Folks interested in lessons learned. And yeah, Lillian, thank you for cheering us on. Yeah, it was a long road, so we'll talk about that. Yeah, we appreciate that. Oh, Julie is researching public interest design with Lakshmi Ramarajan. Great. Yeah, she's kind of an ally of ours. So she's been looking at this field for a long time. Learning how practices work is something that helps new entrepreneurs. Yep. Yeah, one of the things that I'm excited to talk about is that some of these lessons here today didn't necessarily always work out for the firms that tried them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't work. It might mean that there might be a piece of the system that needs to be tweaked. And so I am a huge fan of I think this is a designer's mindset, right? It's we look, we understand systems, and then we think about what could change in that system to apply to a different scenario. What can we tweak to make it better, right? We've got a little bit of systems engineer in us. And that's one of the things that I think if we start to look not just at our projects, but at our practices with that lens, a lot of great stuff happens. All right, folks want to start their own social impact design consultancy. Woo woo, yeah, excited. Okay, all right. So I will get started by introducing, many of you know, I think, the project, right? Our website, proactivepractices.org, pulls together our research over the last 5 years. We did not expect it to take 5 years. Our research on business models of social impact design over the last 5 years. We ended up doing a series of case studies. The idea being that, we really look in depth at one business to understand how they make it work, but then we're also stacking that business up against a couple of other businesses and starting to see if we can find patterns. And we haven't really had a chance to really talk about the patterns that we identified. And one of the things I want to say is that we identified different patterns, right? There's no one theory of everything. Part of what I'll talk about today is, I had a certain set of questions I was interested in. Gilad had a certain set of things he was interested in. And so you're going to hear a highly idiosyncratic approach to what we feel like we learned from it. And then in our last session, our third session, which is in 2 weeks, you'll get a chance to, it's Q&A, right? We'll come without talking points. We'll come really to facilitate and host a discussion to answer your questions. But so where did we start? We started being involved in the social impact, the social entrepreneurship world. I was living in San Francisco before I started design school, and all around me, social entrepreneurship was popping up. People were experimenting with the triple bottom line. We started to see models like Tom's, the one-for-one model, or other socially entrepreneurial ventures, and think, okay, well, can this be done in the design field? And I, at the time, was working for a public interest design firm and got really curious about, well, how do we do this work sustainably, right? I saw, Architectural Record had just published a big issue, and it was a huge milestone at the time on socially impactful design. And, I was excited that we were publishing, that the projects were being highlighted, but I remember being at a Structures for Inclusion conference and seeing a school-based design firm present these great projects and thinking, I want to see more about practice. I want to know, how do you do this when you get out of school? How do you make this a sustainable career path? So I started with a research project at school. I started with an independent study, and I linked up with a friend of mine who'd worked at public architecture, Nick, who linked up with Gilad, and the three of us became a little kind of research collaborative, a little pod, united by our interest in answering these questions for ourselves. And over time, it became pretty clear that we had, I think, somewhat different lenses, which ended up being an asset. You know, when I started this project, I was an outsider to business thinking. I was learning everything for the first time. And in a way, I think it's good that we all had interests, and we all, to some extent, were newbies to this question, because we really thought about, you know, what do I need to know? We kept that kind of audience outsider view. And as a result, I think we were able to answer some key questions for ourselves and not just kind of keep them in the jargon that sometimes is out there. So I want to take a quick moment and have Gilad introduce himself. He's going to get to give you his more full perspective next week. But Gilad, introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gilad Meron. As I said, I was part of this little team, started about 5 years ago to explore all this stuff. I like that Maya has labeled me the optimistic optimist, because I think that was a lot of times the role that I play in this, trying to think really about how this could be a sustainable practice and what are all the strategies and techniques and methods that are working and that can lead us to more socially impactful design processes and practices. So I'm going to be talking a lot more about that next week, and kind of diving a little bit more in depth into specific strategies and methods and things that we've seen rise to the top. So looking forward to that next week, and looking forward to being a part of this today. And I'll join in as we go along and add a few extra points as Maya is presenting.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me introduce myself a little bit more in depth. So and I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am as a person before I came to this question. So I am a little bit, this is how I've come to describe myself. I am a social worker in designer's clothing, in a designer's body, because obviously designers have really awesome fashion taste compared to social workers. But the reason I say this is because my mom is a social worker. If you take offense to that, that's okay. I'm kind of with you too. But my mom is a social worker, and I grew up in a household in which my mom worked with abused children and their families, really thinking about social issues, systemic issues, and I would say really thinking about how people who are on the outside get brought in, and how they don't just get brought in a way that they have to blend into what already exists, but they get to bring who they are into the circle. So, oh, wait a second. There we go. That fashion sense. But I was creatively minded. You know, in high school, I did 2 independent studies. One was a fashion independent study where I had like a fashion show, and I convinced my history teacher to model, and it was crazy. And then the other one was an independent study in gender with the school nurse, because I was having a hard time dealing with the lack of female role models in my youth group. And I was trying to make sense of, like, is this a gender thing? What is gender? And so these were the 2 pieces of me that I think I carried along with me throughout the way. Now, I want to bring you back to where I was when I started this project. So when I started Proactive Practices, I was in design school. It was my last year of school, and they were really pushing people to do thesis. And everybody's thesis, you know, kind of looked the same, because they were pushing people to do a very specific kind of landscape urbanist thesis. And I, deep down inside, was like, I don't know if I love the ideas, but like, I think I have something to say that's different. And I have questions to answer that are different than just doing some awesome project that includes like stamping, you know, wild grass species across military bases. Like so I started this independent research project, and you know, it was an independent study. And by the end of the year, we had done a lot of work. I'd pulled together a report, and Nick and Gilad were working with me, but we weren't quite finished. And I think deep down inside, I kind of wanted to take some risks. I'd grown up in a, you know, very, to some extent, pretty risk averse, you know, somewhat low income, you know, really kind of like fearing not having a full-time job. But I decided that I was going to take the 6 months before my loans kicked in to finish out this project. 6 months, right? Smiling at how much longer it actually took. I ended up getting a research fellowship and cobbling together a couple jobs, including a part-time one at a landscape firm. And I would say that I kind of had my foot on both shores. So I was working part-time for a landscape firm, eventually started ramping up my hours. And then one day I went into work and I got laid off. And so I didn't know what to do. And actually Gilad was one of the, maybe like top first or second or third people that I called my partner, my Gilad, and then I think my mother in that order when I got laid off. And he said, I think you should, he was freelancing at the time. And he said, I think you should go for it. And so I ended up starting a design firm, a social impact design consultancy called Creative Agency, and also starting what I do now mainly, which is Build Yourself, which is an empowerment coaching and training company for women in creative fields, women in design, architecture, engineering. So I work with mid-career women and I help them figure out where they want to go, how to integrate their values into it, and then how to actually navigate bias in order to get there. So, all right, that was about 5 years ago. Now it's 5 years later. It took a lot longer than we thought. I built both of these businesses and took some of the things I learned along the way through this research in building this business. In some ways, the research was a way for me to learn things that I wanted to learn, as well as put that information out there. The empowerment coaching company was a way to kind of maybe push myself to take some risks that I was afraid to take. And then ultimately, we ended up putting out this research, and now I primarily run one business, but it was definitely a kind of holistic journey. So what I want to do is I want to share a couple of lessons that I took away from the research. The first lesson is to fill gaps in the market, but to a point. So I want to introduce this idea by introducing you to Catherine Darnstadt, who founded Latent Design. Latent Design is a firm in Chicago. They do a whole series of work, a lot of small scale public interventions. And you'll hear a little bit more about the kind of work that she does. Also works a lot with nonprofits and larger projects as well. So Catherine started her firm during the last recession. She worked with a lot of nonprofits. First, she was doing that work pro bono, and then she was doing that work low bono. And in one of her projects for Demoiselle du Femme, she went beyond the traditional scope of architecture, and she started to do things like help them with grant applications. She helped them develop a STEM curriculum, which I think is, she was doing it early before we started to see it show up all around the country. And she found another gap. She found that there was a gap in the market for the kinds of smaller scale projects that she wanted to do for these kinds of clients. They were small projects that contractors didn't want to take on. They were under $200,000 to construct. And other contractors, it was just too small of a project for them. So she actually decided to get her general contractor's license in order to fill this gap in the market. Now, she was also doing creative placemaking work. And it was a thing that she started with Architecture for Humanity, and then continued to do this work through Latent Design. And a few years into her practice, the Department of Transportation wanted to monetize vacant spaces and make them also more vibrant, right? More vibrant public spaces. So they put out an RFP, and she ended up competing against a lot of advertising firms who just wanted to put advertising in this space. And she ended up winning the contract on a concept to put micro retail into some of these vacant spaces, right? These underused spaces. But she had to fill gaps in the market, right? She had to rewrite a local building ordinance in order to allow for these kinds of units, right? The local building ordinance didn't allow for these things. She had to move from just being a designer to raising capital to become basically a developer and an operator. And I remember sitting with her over coffee a couple of years ago where she was just, she was trying to raise money from banks. It was a totally different scale of investment than it takes to run a small professional services. And to be honest, it was really hard. She didn't achieve raising that money. Now, I want to say that filling the gaps in the market is a good strategy in a lot of ways. And I think it also is about being really human-centered, being focused on not just what you can offer, but what your clients ultimately need. But I also want to say that it can go too far. So it was really, really hard for her to get that funding because her firm and this effort didn't fit into a typical box for business loans. It required a ton of upfront capital, and I think it ultimately ended up being really difficult for a single founder with a small company to be able to pull off a massive effort like that. So I actually think that this project is one of the most innovative efforts in the creative placemaking sector. I think that with different funding, or maybe, in a slightly different context, I think this thing could have totally taken off. But I do think it's a little bit of a cautionary tale that, you want to be thinking about how can you fill those gaps. But on the other hand, there are also strategic dangers, I guess, to overfilling all the gaps and being everybody to everyone.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, from conversations we've had with Catherine, that she's seen a lot of the risks that she took up front as really sort of long-term investments. And it's something she's spoken about a number of times in terms of the learning she had to go through, the additional work she had to do to understand the permitting process, to get all this new expertise in fundraising, and to understand how retail would plug into creative placemaking projects around the city. All of that she described as something she wasn't really getting paid for, but that in the end actually benefited her tremendously, because she was able to learn all these new skills and ways of doing and incorporate that into future projects. So I think that in line with this lesson of filling gaps in the market, I think you could also think about how do you fill gaps in your own professional skill set.
Yeah. And then how do you also make those investments strategically, right? So there's only so much extra time, extra money. So I actually just had a call with some folks today who are starting a new initiative. And I said, all right, get clear on what is this initiative driving for your business and scale it appropriately, right? Is this the thing you're going to do for a year to bring in client work on this topic? Or, right, what you don't want to do is you don't want to, I think one of the cautionary tales is if you fill all the gaps, then you're constantly kind of making those upfront investments without then capturing those returns in terms of a sustainable business model. All right. Second lesson is to get creative about revenue. So Gilad's going to talk more about the concept of secret sauce, right? Does each firm have a secret sauce that makes them work? So stay tuned. This is why you have to show up next week. But I want to introduce you to Inscape Publico Studio, which has a really, really fascinating model. So they work with nonprofits only through schematic design, right? So from pre-design all the way to schematic design, and they do that through a paired company that they've created that's a nonprofit called Inscape Publico. They also have a for-profit firm named Inscape Studio, and Inscape Studio is sits alongside Inscape Publico. So Inscape Studio actually has staff, they have assets. Inscape Publico doesn't, but Inscape Publico can take in grants and works with nonprofit clients, and will work with them at a subsidized rate all the way through for about a third of the cost of typical architecture services, a third of the way, through the process up to schematic design. Then they give nonprofits their full set, their set that allow, some renderings, allows them to raise money for really expensive capital projects, and then say, you can come back to us and we'll take it from design development all the way to construction administration. So, which is also usually one of the most expensive parts of the process. So the model is that they provide services to nonprofits when they need them most at subsidized rates, and then that actually feeds a for-profit business model. Now, there's a little bit of and I alluded to this earlier, but there's a little bit of so when we started researching Inscape Publico, Inscape Studio, Greg Kearley, who's the founder, had just, I think, hired and then let go of a development director who hadn't worked out, because a key part of this model is to be able to raise grants. Years later, they haven't actually cracked that model. They haven't actually found a way to, or crack that part of the puzzle, found a way to sustainably raise money. And I feel like Gilad might have some thoughts on this. So I want to invite him in if you want to weigh in on this, Gilad.
Yeah, sure. I think that Inscape is a really interesting example of a model that in theory works really well, and in practice has some real world challenges. Again, primarily around fundraising and around this idea of being a nonprofit and needing to raise a lot of money just to do the work that you're doing. And I think for us, that's brought up a lot of questions across the research, not just in the current case studies, but in other research we've done as well, looking at how we can find alternative and supplemental revenue streams for doing this kind of work, and what it looks like to not only be paid for the actual design and production of a project, but how you might be able to supplement that with small sales of outputs, or by writing grants, or doing fundraising, or doing any number of other things. I think what we learned a lot from Inscape Publico is that relying just on grants for that supplemental funding isn't enough. That grants can be really helpful, and fundraising and money from philanthropists can really support projects at critical junctures, but they are not the most stable or sustainable means to really depend upon long-term for a model of business.
Yeah, and so I want to weigh in with two other points, and maybe this is me being the optimistic optimist, but so number one, I think that, so we've started to see, and I think we've started to see in the field at large, a lot more appetite to pay for softer services. About a week ago, I met someone who's running a community engagement firm, and they are growing. And a few years ago, I would have thought, you have to have something else, right? Community engagement can't be your main offering. But I think that, whether it continues remains to be seen, right? Is this a spike or is this a trend? Remains to be seen. But firms that we studied, like Public Workshops, started to basically hire themselves for facilitation services rather than seeing facilitation as a loss leader, right? Something that you do in order to make that future project happen. So I think that's one trend that we're seeing. I think number two, when I think about what I believe happened that with the model is, I think that there's two challenges. One, it's a lot easier to raise money when you stand for a specific kind of impact and get known for that kind of impact. So just serving nonprofits, it's hard to make a call to action, like a sticky call to action for funders. So one of the things we've seen is firms like Mass Design Group really put their stake in the ground on issues of equity, issues of healthcare, right? So it's not the buildings or the facilities, it's what they ultimately deliver, right? It's the impact they ultimately deliver. Number two, development is very difficult. Learning to do development is a difficult skill. It's a skill that doesn't sit easily in architecture firms. And I've seen a couple of firms try to hire a development director to outsource the fundraising, and usually that doesn't work. What has to happen is oftentimes people in charge need to be involved in fundraising. And if they don't like doing fundraising, they need to find a charismatic person who can kind of fit into that role. A development director cannot do it by his or herself. So I think that the model, if I was kind of pulling the puppet strings, I think there's iterations on the model, but it means making different strategic investments and different strategic decisions. So, yeah. Okay. One other example of a firm that I got creative about revenue is Public Workshop, which I mentioned. A small nonprofit in Philadelphia that runs, one of the programs it runs, it's actually now a spin-off organization, is it's called Tiny WPA. So it's a program in which they train teens to address issues in their built environment, right? What are the issues in the built environment, and then to build responses. So in a city like Philadelphia, built environment issues can be last in line for funding when you have pressing issues like education, public safety, public health. And so if you can actually, again, this is about making it about the issue, right? And not just about the work and the service. If you can tap into the funding streams for youth development, for example, you can act and leverage those for built environment improvement. That's actually a very compelling public investment. So here's their model, right? And their outcomes, maybe is like improved built environment. That's great, right? They do building projects, adventure playgrounds, things like that. But the real impact is also civic leadership on the part of their participants, and also that training, that real training. So, all right, those are a couple of the lessons. What I want, so actually let's pop yourself back in the chat box. What questions are you left with, and what ahas do you have, right? Let's make this go two ways, right? This is what I've taken out of them. This is, now what are you taking out of them? Okay, so I'll take one question now. So have we come across a model that does a good job of incorporating or partnering with universities? Yeah, so there's a lot of models out there that do that. The Tulane City Center is is a model. I would say that if you go to the Association for Community Design Conference, which happens every year in June, and actually Gilad is a board member, that's where a lot of these university-based programs staff hang out. And so you can get a lot of tips and intel on how to build one of those relationships, build one of those programs or broker those relationships for yourself. Gilad, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think one of the firms we've looked at a number of times, or organizations, entities, is the Detroit Collaborative Design Center, based out of the University of Detroit Mercy. And I think they're an excellent example of how to do this within a university. Yeah, there's a number of others. I did some research on this previously. So if anyone's particularly interested, just type your name or your email into the chat box. I'm happy to forward some other resources around this to you.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to highlight one other question before we move on, that was asked just a little bit earlier from Sarah A, saying, is there a risk that Inkscape Publico clients have their hopes or expectations raised only to then be disappointed when they can't afford Inkscape Studio? I think that's a really important question, and it's something that Greg and Stefan, one of the other leaders of the firm, talked about a lot. They said that it was really important that from the outset they were transparent about what the total cost would be for the actual full design scope, so that clients would know upfront what they were getting into. And in addition, they thought it was very important that their nonprofit clients paid a portion of the upfront fee. So while they're doing things for about a third of the cost, about 30 cents on the dollar, that is still paid for by the nonprofit. And the way that Greg described it was, if you're working towards long-term build project that's going to be $3 million, if your nonprofit can't even get together $6,000 at the start to start exploring this, then maybe you're not ready to really enter that process right now.
Yeah.
So I think there were a number of other factors they kind of included in there to make sure that firms weren't kind of disappointed later on. But it's a really good question. I'm sure Maya, you have some other thoughts to add as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one of the big takeaways for me throughout the project, and this will actually get into what I'm about to talk about, which also links into a question that we got asked about, how do you do this work after college, right? So especially as a single person consultancy, is that a lot of the time designers will come up with an idea or want to help someone, and they haven't necessarily ground tested. Is that providing value to someone, and is there a revenue stream to pay for that value? Social value is worthwhile, right? But is it providing value? And I think embedded in the idea of having nonprofits pay something for those services is that, I think many of us have maybe been in situations where we're pushing something forward and everyone's like, yeah, sure, that's great. But if you don't have skin in the game on both sides, maybe your nonprofit partner is not actually as invested in the outcome as you think. So, for me, for example, I actually, in my coaching work with women, there's been certain things that I did without pay, or I did for very, very low pay, because my ultimate model is to get women in positions of power and influence on their own terms so that they can actually change the systems that they're in. But I found that my coaching work, there was a sweet spot that I hit where the financial investment was high enough for women to actually say, like, yes, this is a process. This is an investment of my money, but it's also an investment of my time. And the times that people, wanted to do swaps or shares, they didn't actually treat the process with the level of investment of time and energy that would actually help them get that outcome. And then it's a waste of their time and a waste of my time. So it's a big lesson that I took away from this research, actually. So, okay. So, all right. One of the things at the highest level that I took out of this work is the importance of value. And I know this sounds kind of silly, right? It's like, well, duh. But, I was really inspired by the business model canvas, which is a business design tool that I, stumbled upon when I was first trying to figure out how to study businesses. And here's a version that I created for a research publication that I did that was kind of in service of proactive practices. And I just put if you want the full publication, it's called Emerging Models of Architecture Practice. And so it was really starting to think about a business as a system and the relationships between, all of the things you can actually switch or tweak or innovate on, and the relationships between revenue and costs, and then also satisfactions and frustrations. So what I started to get really curious and fascinated about was A, that a business is a system, but B, sometimes it's not actually about the system itself. It's actually about the mindset behind the decisions that create the system, or the way that you actually execute the system? So I think the Greg Kearley, the Inkscape Publico Studio model is a really interesting question of that, right? And that's both the individual's mindset. So, I don't want to do development work, but it's also some of the mindsets that I think we carry around with us as a design field, some of these conventional wisdoms that we carry around with us. So here are a couple of the things that I hear. So I hear designers say, oh, we're not seen as powerful. We're invited to, weigh in on this at the last minute. And, after all of the details have been worked out and the development and all the decisions have been made, and we're just invited in to make it pretty. People also say things like, oh, we just have too many ideas. We want to serve all the sectors, right? We have too many ideas. We can't really focus on, delivering value. We also hear, oh, designers get paid so little. We undersell our services. We compete each other to the ground. How could we ever do pro bono work? And as I started to do my work with women, I started to see these kind of parallel narratives in the way that women hold themselves back and the narratives that they're taught. So, hey, we're not as powerful, right? We're not seen as powerful. And we know, by the way, that that's not just a mindset thing. But, if you take the implicit association test, which is a free online test hosted by Harvard, you will see that we tend to associate women with supportive roles, and we tend to associate men with leadership roles, right? Not probably like the most compelling or aha moment thing you'll hear this year in this session, but it's true. For women, a lot of the challenges that I see is that it's not so much about too many ideas stealing your focus, right? Being overcommitted, but it's almost like too many other people's agendas keeping you from that core message, that core mission you're trying to achieve. And then finally, women, we know that women are actually 2 to 3 times less likely than men to even initiate a negotiation. And we know that there's a pretty big pay gap, right? And so some of these mindsets that I started to see holding back women in their career and business growth were some of the things that the creative industry tells itself, right? The lessons that the creative industry tells itself. So I realized that there was another set of lessons to pull out of these case studies and to pull out of the work that I've been doing over the last 5 years through this empowerment work and through running my own consultancy. So the first lesson is to stop being everything to everyone. A lot of designers, we have this idea of, we can do anything. We can envision the entire solution and, produce the whole thing. If you've heard of the concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, right? The idea of a total, like I designed the building, I designed the furniture, I designed the dishes, down to your little baby fork. So it turns out that Gesamtkunstwerk is actually a topic that, a word that architects really hooked into to describe being, the person in charge of the whole thing, but it actually describes a total immersive experience in theater where the stage is part of it, the audience experience is part of it, and actually the theater isn't directing the entire thing, it's actually a collaborative experience. So one of the things we've seen is that firms like Mass and IDEO.org, right? Firms that really put their stake in the ground on who they serve and actually who they don't serve. And actually Sarah I is on this webinar, and she and her business partner, George I, have this great system for thinking through, is this client actually good for us? Are they mission-based? Can we help them? Do they align with our mission? Can we help them? And I think choosing not just what you do, but what you don't do is super, super important. A number of the women who I've worked with who are actually in social impact design find that they're able to achieve their mission when they stop trying to find ways to fill everybody else's needs. Sometimes it even takes a very hard conversation to say, no, I don't want to do all these things that I could do. I don't want to grow into that role that you want me to grow into. This is what I want to do. And if this organization isn't the place to do that, that's okay, right? I can walk away, right? Saying no is involved in this. Number 2, stop waiting for permission. So, I want to share this story with you. We didn't end up looking at PlayLab as one of our case studies, but, we looked at it as a possibility, and it's kind of stayed with me. So PlayLab put out this idea of a plus pool, a floating pool that would be in the Hudson River, and it would filter water so that you could go swimming in the Hudson and, look up at the awesome New York skyline. And they put out this idea on Kickstarter, right? It was like, it kind of was on Kickstarter, got a lot of attention, and they put this diagram in it. Actually, Archie Lee Coates of PlayLab came to speak at the Association for Community Design a couple years ago and told his story. And, one of the things that I was struck by was that they put out this diagram of like, oh, here's how the water is going to be filtered. And it was like big stuff, little stuff, small stuff. Great. But there wasn't actually any technology behind this. Like, this is just a diagram, right? There's no actual, and here's how it's going to work. So here's what's incredible about this story from my perspective. They put out this idea, and engineers from, I can't remember if it was AECOM or AEROP, approached them and said, we like this idea. We'd like to partner with you in order to produce the technology, this filtration technology. So they, the last I talked to Archie, they were working on it, they were prototyping it, they just kind of hit, one milestone of success. And it turns out that they suspect that the patent revenue from the technology could actually go to funding things like the Plus Pool. So what I think is kind of amazing about this story, especially because I work with a lot of women who are waiting for permission or dealing with perfectionism, and I see it in a lot of designers, right? Who sometimes we don't really actually like, putting our stuff out there and getting real feedback and criticism on it, or letting it possibly fail, is that, he didn't wait till he had it all figured out, right? Archie and his partner, they didn't spend 10 years doing a PhD program to make sure that the tech worked. They put out the idea first, and putting out the idea allowed for the development of the tech. All right. So, okay. I also want to say that, women in particular, and, if you do not identify as a woman, I just want to share that many of us do work with women. And so understanding this is going on will make us better coworkers, partners, etc. Research shows women tend to underestimate themselves potentially by about 20%, whereas men, this comes from a book called The Confidence Code, men are more likely than women to overestimate themselves by about, estimates show, around 30%. So there's actually maybe a 50% gap in terms of where what men are thinking is possible for themselves, and what women are thinking is possible for themselves. And, Gilad and I like, there's tons of times when Gilad is like, oh, why don't you just go do X, Y, Z? And I'm literally a women's empowerment coach, but, some of these things are socialized, and they're very, very deeply held. So what I do want to say is that I won't talk about this a lot here, but if you want to learn more about these issues in depth and how they affect women, you can join my email newsletter. You can text the number 444999 to build yourself to that number, and you can get on my email list. And that's where I talk a lot about limiting beliefs, how people hold themselves back. I do think that humility is really important to doing this work, but I think sometimes what happens is that we need to get bigger and bolder in terms of how we pursue this work, because if we put out a really limited agenda, it's hard to actually build the support to get other people on board to a much bigger idea of how change can be made. Okay, so next lesson is to ditch the trade-off thinking. So I see so much trade-off thinking, right? I think we have this idea that we can make an impact or we can make money, right? I just talked to someone earlier this week who said, I just thought I had to choose, right? And I think we think that a lot in social impact. And it's a little bit of a question of like, well, how much, right? How much impact? How much money? Let's get real specific about the details here. Be successful, right? I hear this a lot from designers who are like, oh, I could either make impact, but then I'll stop getting to use my craft, right? I'll stop being a designer, I see this a lot in the coaching work I do, right? Really do awesome things in your career, or choose to have a family. And what happens sometimes is we get stuck on these conventional wisdom narratives that don't actually serve us. They don't serve us, and they keep us from saying, well, how could it be possible to have more of what I want? It's really about scarcity thinking. It's about growing up in a capitalist world that says, you can do this or you can do that, but there's no nuance and there's no gray zone. But what's really amazing about being a designer is that we are trained to find multiple solutions to the things that we want, right? To say, well, we'd like a little bit of circulation this way, and maybe we'll have to cut down on that ecological program, but we can get it back in that other way. And so one other quick thing to share is that I also run a coaching program for mid-career women. And if you identify as a woman and you're resonating with some of this mindset stuff and you're thinking, oh my God, this is me, this is what I really need to work on, then I would love to start a conversation. So you can email me or you can reach out, you can schedule a conversation with me. So what I want to share is one woman who I worked with who I think exemplifies. She was working in a public interest design setting, and I think she exemplifies this scarcity mindset. So she was growing in her career, but she wanted to figure out, where do I go from here? And when we really started talking about it, she automatically assumed that she couldn't grow in her current company. And it's because she hadn't seen other people do what she was doing in her company. And she had joined the field during the recession when there weren't a lot of jobs in public interest design. So, the person who's getting out of college. And she took that mindset with her for about 10 years. And she was in this company that was giving her a runway, but she couldn't see the runway in front of her because she was thinking, no, there's no way, there's no jobs out there in public interest design. So I'm going to hit some kind of glass ceiling where I won't be able to go farther in this job and in this career. And so what I had her do is I had her look at other movements that had found a home in her company and had found higher level roles, managing budgets, managing projects, really making incredible impact happen. And I'd ask her to look at how those agendas had actually found a foothold in her company. And we started to map out a path for how she could do that in her company. And the idea is that, if she hits obstacles on the way that she can't surpass, then that's okay, right? She will maybe, she'll find there are more roles than there ever were, especially for experienced people. She would find a way to transition her skills and bring them in-house to someone else. But part of what she might be able to do, if she wasn't just convinced that, there was like a closed door, like a closed door that she could never enter because there's no jobs, there's no way to do this work in the field. Part of what she would do by having that mindset is she would actually start to find creative solutions. So she realized she actually needed to start to advocate for her work differently and not describe it just as the design work, but tie it to actually two specific outcome areas and get really, really clear on what her theory of change was. She also realized she needed to build visibility for her effort and for her nascent movement that she's growing within the company. And so she started to not think, is this possible? But she started to think, okay, how do I make a strategic plan about how this can be possible? So that mindset shift, right, of if you see trade-off thinking, it's not to say that it isn't pointing to some real dynamics in the world, but sometimes that trade-off thinking is just an issue in society that's begging to be dealt with, especially if you go about it strategically. Now, how do you do it strategically? Get under the hood. So one of the things we did in this work that I'm so proud of is that we really, we got under the hood. We looked at numbers. We tried to understand, where's the money coming from and the profit coming from? What's the work? Are you specializing in a couple of things? And we used our design skills to actually start to look at this analytically and find patterns. This is from Emerging Modes of Architecture Practice. I did profile a lot of social impact design firms, and a lot of this information was drawn from just internet research, right? Like good old stalking. But when you start to look at multiple pathways and models in contrast with each other, when you start to use your analytic design skills to not just focus on the project, but on the context of the project, you actually start to have a lot of ahas about what could be possible, right? And you can do that at the scale of your public interest design career, or you can do that at the scale of your business, right? Maybe this thing about Inkscape didn't work, but maybe you could tweak some model to make it work for you. And then finally, it comes down to taking risks, right? It's a risk to say, you know what, I'm going to push against this trade-off model. Wait, I'm going to try this a different way. I'm going to propose instead of waiting for permission, right? It was a risk for Catherine to start her firm. It was a risk for Alex Gilliam, who runs Public Workshop, was navigating a lot of uncertainty and took a lot of risks and a lot of hits in his life. And the thing about risk is that risk, the way that you get more comfortable taking risks is you take small risks, right? You start small and slowly you build your capacity to be someone who can take more informed risks. You build your power, your willingness to do something that hasn't been done before. When I started this research with Gilad and with Nick, I was a student. I didn't know how to do what I was doing. It took a lot of pitching and kind of asking for help and advice. And I was a little bit of like I kind of liked to like get things perfect before I put them out in the world. That has totally changed. But, in that time, I ended up pitching the dean of students at school that we needed a class on leaning in. And that's what ultimately ended up becoming my Build Yourself, my workshop. I said no to working full time for 6 months, which was so frightening. And, I ended up founding my design consultancy. At a certain point, after that layoff, I decided that I was going to think about my design consultancy as a 3-year fellowship and like take my other foot off the shore, saying no to a bad project, right? Saying no to a client, right? That's something that, like I said, Greater Good Studio, I'm so impressed by how they got really clear on what works and what doesn't. And they continue to iterate that. And sometimes you get pushback or you deal with fear when you say no to something. You deal with your fear of scarcity. So each risk you take builds the rest. And part of it is knowing the strategies and, which we love to be able to share with proactive practices. But part of it, if this is what you want to do, or if what you are doing is about making a commitment to take that next step, that next risk, and feeling, sometimes it means like recognizing the right level for you is if you feel just a little bit of butterflies in your stomach, that maybe you're doing the right thing. Anyways, so that's my story. That's what I took out of it. I want to say thank you so much for being here. We actually have, we officially end at 1:45, but we are here for the next 15 minutes. If anyone's got questions, I know that there's probably been a lot of commentary in the chat box. So we could take a few questions now. And don't forget that we also have in our third session is all questions all the time. So we get to really dive deep into even more things.
I want to start just by speaking to one of the questions that was just asked, and I'm sure you have some interesting perspective on it as well, Maya, from Tina, who asked, are there more concrete examples of public interest design firms? There really are very few, right? It's a really good question, and it depends a lot on how we're defining public interest design firm. It's this kind of broad term that people use to apply to a lot of different types of businesses, some nonprofits, some for-profits, some university centers. And I can tell you that there are definitely dozens, if not hundreds, of public interest design firms around the country, but they really range in the types of work they do and the ways in which they practice. So there are some nonprofit design firms like Mass Design Group, which is one of the ones we profiled, which is really solidly just focused on public interest design, and that's their sole kind of mission and approach. But there's other firms similar to the ones that we talked about with UTIL, for example, another one we did a case study on, where they incorporate some of this work by doing public sector work. And they really try and do public interest work by working with city governments on projects that are going to benefit the public. And then there's other types like Inkscape Public Code that are somewhere in between the two, sometimes working for clients, sometimes working for nonprofits. So I list these all just to say that there's a range of different ways that design and architecture firms are getting involved in public interest work. And just because they don't do exclusively public interest work doesn't mean they're not kind of in this paradigm of public interest design firms.
Yeah. So our research took a little bit of a hit early on because we ended up getting some funding for the NEA, although this research took a lot of sweat equity on our parts. But we were trying to get another grant from a foundation, and they asked us, do you define public interest as serving low-income communities? And we said, no, we don't. Not because that's not actually, so I think both of us, the issues that I am laser focused on are issues of mostly gender equity, but I think you can't talk about gender equity without talking about racial equity and low-income communities and economic development. You're going to hear, I think, about some of what Gilad has also been doing over the past 5 years, and also those are primary areas of focus for him. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to get a broader sense of how these firms are structured and work and what the typologies are. So we looked at firms that had, some of them we didn't actually study, but had notions of public interest that didn't actually jive with our own notions of public interest, because we wanted to take a broader look, and we ended up foregoing that funding in order to maintain that broader look in our research. So I feel like I find out, maybe I see things in a more nuanced way and not in a black and white way, right? You are for profit or not profit. You are this or that. But I think that there's so many impact models out there. And I also think that every business, every career is a trade-off, but you get to choose what are those trade-offs going to be that you make and you own. And you also get to choose, are you going to pivot or evolve or shift? And so I see, just like I said, the other day, I just learned about a new community engagement firm. I found a really interesting design, a firm that does a lot more kind of research design and still kind of has a design thinking methodology, but wouldn't be what a traditional architect would think of as design. So I think there's a lot more out there than we tend to see. And there's a great resource. So as we mentioned, Association for Community Design is a kind of, I would say, the hub for public interest design, at least in terms of architecture and built environment in the US. So they have an annual conference, and Curry Stone, which is an organization, a foundation, has a podcast that our friend Eric Cezal runs. And they also, if you're trying to find out about more of these models, those are two places to go. Because at this point, we've finished our ongoing coverage of this field.
And I just want to shamelessly plug the ACD conference, since, as Maya mentioned, I'm a part of the organization. It's going to be in Greenwood, Mississippi on June 28th and 29th. And I can tell you from the inside where you're going to have a ton of amazing sessions, really unpacking all kinds of topics around community design. And I'll share the link in the chat box in case anyone's interested. And I just want to add one more comment in terms of this question about public interest design and how it appears in different firms. I think the terminology can sometimes be really important. There's three terms that seem to come up very frequently: public interest design, community design, and social impact design. And while a lot of them are used interchangeably, I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes they're seen as having slightly different focus. So public interest design, really looking at broadly how can design be benefiting the public. And that brings up really interesting questions about which public and who is included in those publics and things like that. And then community design is really focused on community engaged processes and community oriented and community driven work that really speaks a little bit more to the sort of social and economic impact factors that Maya was mentioning. And then lastly, social impact design is often spoken about kind of in terms of IDEO.org and a lot of these new wave social innovation design firms that are really focused on creating impact and less so on broadly the public or a specific community, but at scale, how can we create impact? So there's a lot more to unpack there, and a lot we could have a whole webinar just about definitions, but I just wanted to share a little bit about how we think about some of those different terms sometimes.
Yeah, so I'm going to be putting a link to the Curry Stone Social Design Insights podcast in the chat box. And also Kendall Nicholson, who is with ACSA, also said that they've got a community design resource list, and he put the link in the chat box. Okay, so other questions. All right, so we had a question on, in the spirit of putting your ideas out there early on, any advice for experimenting with this work before starting a business entity? Okay, so I think Jenna, who asked this question, is also the person who said, should I do this right? I'm going to answer a question that's not quite what Jenna asked, and then I'm going to put in her question. So there's a debate of when do you do this? When do you start, right? So the firm the nonprofit I worked for in public architecture was started by a guy who'd been running an architecture firm for years and then started doing social impact work and actually So, that's one model, right? Or, George and Sarah of Greater Good Studio, I think George worked for IDEO for a number of years before starting Greater Good Studio. One of the benefits to that is that you get training from other people, you get you get good relationships, right? At the end of the day, a lot of business, whether it's social impact for profit or nonprofit, is relationship based, right? It's the quality of your relationships that tend to determine a lot of what's possible for you. You may be able to build up some savings, which give you a little bit more of a chance to take risks. That's one option. I think the other option, which is kind of the path that I ended up taking, is I didn't have, I had a few years of work experience in between undergrad and grad school. And then I learned on the job by doing the job. And I would say that For me, what's been really helpful is to always be learning, right? I listen to a lot of podcasts. I read 100 books last year. I set a goal to read 100 books last year. And, that I'm kind of always, I'm a little bit of people make fun of me a little bit that I'm like a walking encyclopedia for stats on women in the workplace. And so to always be learning and then applying it to your own work. And I would say also experimenting with the work before, this is to Jenna's question, experimenting with the work before starting a business entity. I think to have things that are portfolioable as you start are good, right? When you first start, you need examples of how you've created value for other people. Even if they're a little bit hypothetical, sometimes that's all you need to get your first ability to do a project. So that might be that you do a low bono project or a pro bono project, or you leverage something in school in order to create a portfolio project and to kind of build up a couple of small portfolio projects. And then I would say that the other piece of advice is to be building a network tied to the kind of work that you want to do, and to get comfortable with that. It took me a long time to get comfortable pitching my business, and asking, just because I'm an empowerment coach and I teach a lot of women to do this. I'm actually working with a woman right now who's dealing with how much she doesn't like pitching, but also has a really big contribution to make. The pitch, or that conversation is that fundamental step you need to get through in order to be able to make that impact. So I would say the two things I'd work on is build that portfolio, and then also get more comfortable building that network, and then, asking for the opportunities that you want, asking people to hire you, or depending on what your model is, where to fund you.
There's another question I want to respond to quickly from Vanessa, saying, in your case studies, do you reference the business entity type? C, 503, corporate, etc. Yeah, we do. So if you read through the case studies online, there is in each one we talk about what their business structure is and how they operate. I will say that I think it's really important to recognize, and I'll speak about this a little bit more next week, that the business structure really is just a sort of framework, a legal framework for how you're going to operate and how you're going to do business, and specifically how you're going to report the business that you do to the IRS. Everything I think we've learned throughout the past couple of years of speaking with firms who do this work have kind of led to a certain understanding that the business structure, the legal structure, isn't actually that important. It's about the work that you're going to do and the processes you want to use to do that work, and then just finding the legal structure that best fits those approaches and those processes.
Yeah. So I want to take a quick moment and ask you to type in the chat box, what is your biggest takeaway from this session? Okay. Sarai, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, is like, I have too many to narrow down. Resources, groundwork. Okay, don't be all things to all people. Take a stance and focus on issues. Sarah, who wrote that, I think I actually from the outside think you do that very well. Narrow down. Okay, yeah. Some of the multi-passionates in there. Actually, you know what I'll do is I'm going to put in the chat box. I also have I have a piece on having the struggles a lot of creatives and have narrowing down, and some of the strategies that you can use in order to kind of narrow down without feeling like you're cutting off all parts of yourself. Refine your mission. Yep. Risks that you've taken are not unusual, right? They're the only way to grow. Absolutely. And I think sometimes if you're doing it alone, right? If you're doing it alone, you're taking those risks by your lonesome, and then you're feeling, you're facing ups, but you're also facing downs and rejections, and having a community of people to celebrate wins with and to celebrate the fact that you showed up, even if it didn't work out the way you wanted to, is really important, which is why you should get connected to networks of other people who are doing this, even if it's just one other person that you meet here or going to the ACD conference. Yeah. Getting creative about revenue. Yes. Okay. So other people nerd out about that just the way I do. Woohoo. Changing the trade-off mentality. Yeah, yeah. Fundraising is a skill. Be known for impact first. Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, we are, here's what, oh, let's see. Tina's saying, how can we connect with each other? We're going to have to think about that. So come back to our next session. It's kind of like the Arabian Nights. And on that note, come back to tomorrow night, actually to next Wednesday. We're going to be doing another session with Gilad. This is recorded. We'll put it up on our website. We'll probably also email it out to you. And yeah, we're excited to continue the conversation. So between now and then, I'm giving you an assignment. Come up with one burning question that you have, and if we don't get to take it at Gilad's session, we'll take it in our last Q&A discussion, and that'll also be an opportunity to connect with each other. All right, thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you next week.